Hey there, Sleepless Rabble. Let me take over for a while. Tonight we're talking about the true story of Samuel Little, a man the FBI later described as the most prolific offender of his kind in American history. A man connected to more than 90 disappearances. A man whose actions stretched across decades and across an entire continent, leaving behind a trail of women who simply vanished from the edges of society. But before we dive into his story, there's something we need to share with you. Honestly, directly, without the usual sugarcoating. We've been working hard on these long true crime episodes. Really hard. Hours of research, writing, structuring, editing. Nights where you're staring at your screen thinking, okay, why am I emotionally invested in an autopsy report from 1979? And then, after all that work, YouTube sometimes decides that maybe a tiny little handful of people should even see it. And you sit there at 3 in the morning, exhausted, with a script that took a chunk of your soul to write. And the platform shrugs and says, 27 views, good luck. It's frustrating. It's humbling. And in a weird way, it's heartbreaking. Because we don't make these stories halfway. We put a whole heart into them. So we've decided we need to slow down a little with the big true crime pieces. We're not quitting, never that, but we have to protect our own energy too. And if you want these deep dive episodes to continue, genuinely, your like, your subscription, your comment, they matter more than you think. They tell the algorithm, hey, this deserves to be seen. And they tell us, hey, this isn't for nothing. And honestly, that means the world. Alright, let's talk about Samuel Little. He travelled from place to place for more than 40 years. Quiet, forgettable, drifting. And along his route, women disappeared. Women who lived in the shadows. Women whom society ignored. Women whose absence rarely triggered an investigation strong enough to connect the dots. He later spoke of 93 people he harmed. Investigators confirmed more than sexig of those cases. The rest remained somewhere between confession, memory, and the silence of the American backroads. But stories like his never begin with headlines or body counts. They begin with childhoods, with environments, with impulses that grow in the dark long before anyone pays attention. So, like always, Sleepless Rabble, we're not starting at the end. We're going all the way back to where it began. He arrived in this world in 1940, in a tiny southern town where nothing exciting ever happened, unless you count humidity, gossip, and the occasional collapsing barn. Reynolds. Georgia wasn't exactly the kind of place where destinies were forged. It was more the kind of place where people lived their entire lives without ever leaving a 20-mile radius. And into this stillness came a baby boy named Samuel Little, a child whose future would eventually rewrite entire FBI handbooks, though nobody in Reynolds would have believed that for a second. His beginnings weren't gentle. His mother struggled, financially, socially, emotionally. The kind of struggle where stability isn't a luxury, it's a rumor. Some accounts claim she worked jobs on the margins. Others suggest she was simply overwhelmed. Whatever the exact truth, one thing is carved into history. Sam's early world was chaotic, unsteady, a place where adults tried their best, but their best wasn't nearly enough. He was moved around often, sometimes to relatives, sometimes to temporary rooms that smelled like dust and old wood. That kind of upbringing doesn't create a strong sense of home. It creates a sense of drifting before you even understand what drifting means. Children like him learn early that nothing stays still. Not people, not places, not promises. Teachers described him as quiet, withdrawn, and impossible to read. And not the cute kind of quiet, not the shy boy who likes books. Quiet. No. More the kind of quiet where you look at him and think, that child is either very lost or thinking very strange thoughts for a 9-year-old. He didn't cause trouble, he didn't fight, he didn't shout, he just watched. And that was the unsettling part, because children watch all the time. But Sam watched differently. He studied people the way some kids study comic books, with devotion, with intensity, with a kind of private fascination, especially the way people moved, the way they touched their own neck when they were nervous, the way someone swallowed when they were uncomfortable. One teacher remembered that whenever a student coughed or cleared their throat, Sam's eyes fixed on them just a little too long. At the time, nobody thought much of it. This was the 1940s, the era of kids are weird, they'll grow out of it. Spoiler, he didn't. Later in life, when he described these early impulses, he did it with a calmness that made investigators shift uncomfortably in their seats. He said he felt a pull, even as a child. Something he couldn't name. Something he didn't understand. He said it casually, as if he were talking about realizing he liked baseball. But there was no excitement in his voice. No drama. Just a matter-of-fact confession of a child noticing things he shouldn't have noticed and feeling things no child should feel. School never anchored him. He struggled not because he couldn't learn, but because he couldn't be bothered. The world inside his head was far more interesting than whatever multiplication table the teacher desperately tried to explain. He drifted mentally long before he drifted physically. And because he wasn't loud, because he wasn't disruptive, because he didn't set anything on fire, he went largely unnoticed, a ghost child, in plain sight. And let's be honest, the mid-century American school system wasn't exactly known for its deep psychological insight. If you weren't failing spectacularly or breaking windows, teachers simply wished you luck and hoped you'd find a job one day. Sam didn't stand out enough to trigger concern. He wasn't the class clown, the bully, or the prodigy. He was the kid whose chair you could walk past 10 times before remembering he was sitting in it at all. That early invisibility shaped him far more than anyone understood back then. He learned, without ever being taught, that if you're quiet enough, polite enough, forgettable genug, Menschen dich einfach übersehen. They forget your face. They forget your presence. They forget anything you were doing or planning. He dropped out of school early, long before anyone had a chance to redirect him. And with that, childhood ended not with a dramatic crash, but with a quiet slide into adulthood. An adulthood built on instability, detachment, and impulses no one had ever recognized for what they were. The stage was set, not with violence, not with big headlines, but with a childhood that made one thing painfully clear. Samuel Little learned to disappear long before he learned anything else. And that skill, the art of not being seen, would become the foundation of everything that followed. By the time Samuel Little reached adulthood, he had already mastered something most people spend their whole lives figuring out: how to move through the world without leaving a ripple behind. He wasn't charismatic enough to stand out and not troubled enough to be flagged. He was simply there, a shadow with shoes. His 20s unfolded in the same quiet, ambiguous rhythm as his childhood, drifting from job to job, town to town, coast to coast. He worked wherever someone was desperate enough to hire a young man with no real resume, and even weniger motivation. Construction sites, warehouses, janitorial work, odd jobs in places that smelled like sweat and old paint. Nothing permanent, nothing respectable, Nothing anyone would write on a CV. But there was one thing he liked: boxing gyms. And not the glamorous Rocky Balboa boxing in a cloud of a chalk kind. No. The sad, flickering light bulb kind. The ones with punched out windows. A mold smell nobody talked about. And a radio in the corner playing whatever station it could cling to. He wasn't exactly great at it, but he was strong, he had stamina, and he enjoyed the physicality. The technique? The discipline? Definitely not. But he had a certain talent for getting hit in the face without caring too much. And in some circles, that was enough. He wandered through these gyms the same way Erdurk's Leben wandered, quietly, unnoticed, almost politely invisible. The men around him barely learned his name. Sam. Sammy. That tall, quiet guy. Close enough. Outside the ring, he developed a pattern that would follow him through his early adulthood. Small-time trouble, shoplifting, breaking into abandoned places, taking whatever wasn't nailed down. Never dramatic, never bold, just enough to attract occasional police attention, but not enough to be taken seriously. Officers would pick him up, write something down, let him go. A mild inconvenience at best. And every time he slipped through the cracks, he learned a dangerous lesson. The world wasn't watching him. Not even a little. Not even when he gave it reason to. That's when the travelling began, not the grand, romantic, discover yourself across America. Travelling. More the I have nothing, nowhere and no one. Might as well see what's around the next corner. Travelling. Buses, hitched rides, sleeping in cheap motels, sometimes in cars, sometimes in places you wouldn't let a houseplant spend the night. He floated from state to state, from city to city, like a man who didn't understand what roots were. And in each new place, he did the same thing. Blend in, observe, attach himself to nightlife, bars, sidewalks, communities at the edges. He gravitated toward women who lived in the margins. Not because he had a plan, at least not at first, but because those were the people who noticed him. Noticed him in the sense that they would speak to him, sit with him, laugh with him. Society didn't exactly roll out a red carpet for him, and so he gravitated to circles that accepted drifters, loners, and men whose lives didn't fit neatly into forms or files. He could be oddly charming when he wanted to, soft-spoken, polite, the kind of man who didn't raise alarms, didn't brag, didn't emanate obvious danger. You wouldn't remember his face 2 hours later, and that was precisely how he liked it. His record grew as the years passed. More petty theft, more break-ins, the occasional scuffle when alcohol emboldened him a little too much. Police departments from Miami to Cleveland had his fingerprints somewhere in their filing cabinets. If someone had laid all his early reports next to each other, a clear pattern would have emerged. A drifter collecting mischief like postcards. But the reports weren't next to each other. They were scattered across the country. A speeding ticket here, a trespassing note there, an arrest for theft in some town nobody pronounces the same way twice. No one connected anything. No one paid attention. And Sam understood something quietly, instinctively, and with increasing confidence. If you keep moving, your past can't catch you. And if nobody is watching you closely, you can do things without anyone remembering you were even in the room. His early adulthood was not dramatic. It wasn't shocking or headline-worthy. It was simply the formation of a man learning that anonymity could be a weapon, long before he discovered the full extent of what he could use it for. Before Samuel Little became the man whose crimes would stretch across decades, he met someone who would shape his wandering life more than anyone else. Aurelia June Dorsey. And if you imagine some glamorous femme fatale stepping out of a smoky bar at midnight, stop right there. Jean was not that woman. She was older, sharper around the edges, and had the energy of someone who'd seen enough nonsense to last 3 lifetimes. If life were a bar fight, John was the woman still standing when the chairs stopped flying. They met in the 1970s, in a corner of the world where lonely people seemed to cluster. Not out of romance, but out of practicality. Samuel drifted into her life like he drifted into everything else. Quietly, politely, with that strange ability he had to look harmless even when he absolutely wasn't. June, for reasons that will forever confuse historians, decided he was worth keeping around. Their relationship was unconventional. Not fiery, not passionate. More like 2 stray cats deciding to share the same dumpster because it keeps the rain off. June needed help. Samuel needed company. And both needed someone who wouldn't ask too many questions. What they did share was a talent for taking things that didn't belong to them. June was a professional shoplifter, not the teenage shove a lipstick in your pocket type, but the full-grown, I can empty half this store before anyone notices type. She had technique. She had confidence. And most importantly, she had absolutely no shame about it. If capitalism left something unattended, Jean felt personally invited. Samuel joined in with enthusiasm. Suddenly, they had a system. June stole. Sam carried. Sometimes they swapped roles when one of them got bored. Police reports from that era paint a hilarious picture. A mismatched duo drifting from city to city, stealing everything from clothing to food, to bizarre household items no one in their situation could possibly need. A floral teapot? Sure. A pair of curtain rods? Why not? 17 cans of pineapple. Absolutely essential. They rarely stayed in the same place for long. Jean had outstanding warrants. Sam had, well, a growing list of violent assaults that somehow never stuck. Together they lived out of cars, motels, and places you wouldn't leave a dog in. That life was a loop of stealing, moving, drinking, laughing at their own bad luck, and starting the entire disaster again in the next town. And here comes the uncomfortable question true crime fans have argued about for years. Did Jean know? Did she know Sam was attacking women long before the country realized he was one of the most prolific killers in American history? There's no clear evidence she did. But also, no clear evidence she didn't. Here's what we do know. Jean knew he disappeared at night, often for hours. She knew he returned with scratches sometimes, or dirt on his clothes, or this eerie blank calmness he carried after he harmed someone. She knew women around them vanished in suspicious patterns. She knew he had a violent history long before the world connected the dots. And she knew he was strangely drawn zu Frauen, die allein wären, verletzlich, isoliert. Was she afraid of him? Protected by him? Dependent on him? All of the above? Their dynamic was the perfect storm. June covered for him without meaning to. She kept him fed, kept him sheltered, kept him mobile. Her constant need to move from one theft to the next gave him the ideal cover for his own crimes. A new city meant a new opportunity, a new victim, a new place where nobody knew his face. They weren't Bonnie and Clyde. They weren't partners in crime in the glamorous sense. They were 2 broken people orbiting each other so closely that Sam slipped through the country like smoke, leaving devastation behind while Jean focused on her own chaos. As the years passed, their bond grew into something odd, not romantic but loyal in its own twisted way. She stayed until her health failed. He stayed because she was the only person who had ever tolerated him for so long. When Jean died in the early 1980s, something in Samuel changed. Okay, he became more unstable, more unpredictable, more unmoored. Jean had been a strange kind of anchor, and when she was gone, he drifted deeper into the darkness he had already been shaping. By the time the 1970s settled in, Samuel Little had quietly crossed into territory that should have alarmed every police department from Miami to Los Angeles. Women were coming forward with stories that were horrifyingly similar. They had been beaten, strangled, left unconscious in places no human being should ever have to wake up in. Some had crawled to safety. Some had staggered through the night until they found help, and all of them described the same man, same height, same build, same unsettling calmness in the way he went after them. It should have been enough to stop him very early. But the world he operated in made stopping him nearly impossible. The truth is uncomfortable. The women who survived him were women the system already ignored. Many battled addiction. Many worked in the streets or lived transient lives. Many had been dismissed by law enforcement long before they ever crossed paths with Samuel Little. And when they came forward saying, "This man tried to kill me," the reaction they received was more procedural than protective. A kind of tired skepticism that assumed they were unreliable before anyone even heard their full statement. And Samuel, clever in a streetwise, predatory way, noticed that. He saw which women were listened to and which weren't. He understood that the world graded victims on a cruel curve. And he understood that if he chose the right women, the ones society was already looking past, he could attack with near total impunity. Arrests did happen, quite a few, actually. He was picked up in Ohio for assault, later in Florida for another attack, in Mississippi for yet another. California had him in handcuffs at least twice. His criminal record during these years grew thicker than most people's tax returns, and each case was almost identical. A woman who survived, a description matching him perfectly, physical injuries that left no doubt about what happened. Yet the pattern that followed was painfully predictable. He'd be charged, held for a while, and then the case would quietly collapse. Maybe the victim couldn't appear in court. Maybe prosecutors thought juries wouldn't believe her. Maybe the police didn't prioritize the case because they were overstretched and understaffed. Whatever the reason, the ending stayed the same. Samuel Little walked out of police custody and vanished into the next town. In 1976, a 22-year-old woman identified him as the man who had beaten her so severely that she barely survived. She told the police everything. Her injuries were obvious. Her testimony was clear. A case like that should have led to a long sentence, the kind that keeps people off the streets for decades. Instead, the punishment amounted to little more than a temporary inconvenience. A few months in custody, a slap on the wrist, and out he went again, as if the system had decided he was merely an enthusiastic troublemaker, rather than an escalating predator. Then came San Diego in 1984. 2 attacks, 2 women, 2 detailed statements. Both survived. Both were brave enough to speak. Both identified him. And for a brief moment, it looked as if the justice system might actually do its job. He was convicted. And for the first time in his life, he received more than a couple of months behind bars. But even then, the sentence was shockingly small. 2.5 years. He served them, stepped back out into the world, and simply continued where he left off. 2.5 years for nearly killing 2 women. If you want to understand why he was able to continue hurting people for another 3 decades, this is why. The system kept opening the door for him and politely letting him walk through. His arrest record during these years is almost darkly comedic in its consistency. A kidnapping here, a brutal assault there, all connected by the same method and the same surviving witness statements. It was all there, in black and white, sitting in police folders across multiple states. But because no single department had the full picture, and because his victims were women, the culture treated as unreliable, the pattern never came together. Samuel didn't have to outsmart anyone. He didn't need disguises, false identities, elaborate plans, or the strategic genius people incorrectly attribute to violent men. He simply needed the apathy of a system that decided certain women weren't important enough to fight for. And so he kept going. Each arrest, each dismissal, each dropped charge became another lesson, another reinforcement, another quiet confirmation that he could choke a woman until she went limp and walk away without consequence. He learned that the law had weak spots, huge, gaping ones, and that he could slip through them as easily as he slipped through town after town. By the end of the 1980s, his trajectory was no longer subtle. He wasn't just attacking women, he was becoming a man who killed them with frightening regularity. And the institutions that should have stopped him had, unintentionally, cleared the runway for one of the deadliest crime sprees in American history. When Samuel Little walked out of prison in the late 1980s, the timeline of his life shifted from disturbing to catastrophic. The small assaults, the near-fatal attacks, the endless stream of survivors whose cases were brushed aside, all of that had been the prelude. The next phase was the main act. And now, without Jean, without supervision, without stability, he drifted into a darker rhythm that no one would recognize until it was far too late. From this point onward, the pattern becomes painfully consistent. He traveled constantly, West Coast, Midwest, South, back again, rarely staying in one city long enough to memorize the street names. If he arrived somewhere on a Monday, he might be gone by Thursday. Sometimes he slept in cars, sometimes in motels that smelled like cigarette smoke and damp carpet, sometimes with strangers who thought he was quiet but harmless. He blended in wherever he landed, because Sam had perfected invisibility long before he ever perfected violence. His method was always the same. He looked for women who were alone, women who were struggling, women who lived in spaces society refused to illuminate. Street corners, bars at closing time, parking lots behind neon-lit motels, the in-between spaces of American life. He chose women who were unlikely to be reported missing quickly. Women whose absence would not trigger search parties, headlines, or urgent investigations. Not because these women deserved such indifference, but because that was the cruel reality of the era. Sam didn't kill impulsively. That's the chilling part. There was no frenzy, no panic, no dramatic outburst. He used strangulation not just because it was quiet, but because it gave him control. Complete, unbreaking control. And afterward, he left almost nothing behind. No weapon, no dramatic crime scene, no trace that screamed, "Someone was murdered here." He left bodies in alleys, in vacant lots, in isolated patches of land near highways, in places the world didn't check unless someone complained about a smell. And because there was no blood, no noise, no witnesses, and because his victims were women the world already ignored, he passed through cities like a cold draft, the kind you feel but can't quite locate. His movements across the country were so fluid that investigators later struggled to reconstruct his timeline. Los Angeles 1 month, Pascagoula the next, Cincinnati, Miami, El Paso, Phoenix, Las Vegas, New Orleans, all blending together in a haze of cheap motels, drifting crowds, and nights where Sam prowled the edges of the city with a calmness that felt rehearsed. What made him so effective wasn't intelligence. It wasn't sophistication. It wasn't the Hollywood version of a criminal mastermind. It was far simpler than that. He chose victims who weren't protected. He killed in a way that left barely any evidence. He left town before anyone realized a woman was missing. And he moved so frequently that no two police departments ever connected their cases. In a pre-digital era, every town was its own island, and Sam traveled the archipelago. Sometimes he stayed longer in a place if he found a rhythm he liked. A steady bar, a familiar corner, a woman who tolerated his presence. But eventually something would shift. A suspicious look, a police cruiser slowing down, a conversation that made him feel exposed. And he'd move on, as casually as someone deciding they'd rather try a different restaurant. His life had no furniture, no belongings, no plan, just motion. His victims in these years were often found without identification. Many were never identified at all. They were listed as Jane Doe, placed in cold morgue drawers, buried in paupers' graves, and forgotten by everyone except the handful of detectives who couldn't shake the feeling that someone out there was preying on vulnerable women in a pattern too deliberate to be coincidence. And this is the part that still breaks modern investigators. So many police departments came close to catching him. A few noticed similarities. A few suspected a serial predator long before the FBI did. But without DNA technology, without shared databases, without the ability to communicate across state lines, everything remained fragmented. Sam understood this fragmentation better than the men hunting him. He exploited it. He relied on it. And he wrapped himself in it like a blanket. As the years rolled into the 1990s, then into the 2000s, he continued killing with the same eerie consistency. The cities changed, the bars changed, the victims changed. But his method did not. He was a man who found a way to walk through America while leaving behind a trail of bodies that almost no one connected. Not because he was brilliant, but because the system couldn't hold the pieces together. He would later brag that he never left evidence because God made me talented. But the truth is far less mystical and far more damning. The country was simply not looking for the women he killed, and he knew it. For decades, Samuel Little moved like a ghost through American cities, seen by many, remembered by none. But by the late 2000s, the world had changed in the one way that mattered most to him. Technology finally cared. DNA databases were growing, police departments were reluctantly learning to talk to one another, and old evidence kits that had been gathering dust for 20, 30, sometimes 40 years were being reopened. Sam had spent his life slipping through cracks. Now, the cracks were shrinking. And he had no idea. In 2012, he was living the same life he always had. Drifting, existing in the margins, hanging around transient communities, staying in motels with carpets that had given up all hope. He was older, slower, but still carrying himself with the quiet confidence of a man who believed he would never be caught. According to him, he felt protected. According to reality, he was simply overdue. His downfall didn't begin with a dramatic raid or a high-speed chase. No Hollywood soundtrack, no flashing neon police lights. Instead, he was arrested in Kentucky on an outstanding narcotics warrant out of California. The kind of technical, boring problem he'd brushed off his entire life. Officers picked him up, processed him, shipped him to Los Angeles like an overdue library book. He expected what always happened. I'll sit for a bit, they'll get bored, and I'll walk out the door. But Los Angeles had something he never accounted for. A cold case unit with a habit of digging deeper than most. When Sam arrived in California, detectives pulled an old DNA sample from one of his more recent arrests. They ran it through CODIS, the national database, and for the first time in his life, Samuel Little didn't slip through. The results pinged, not once, not twice, 3 times. 3 unsolved murders from 1987 and 1989. 3 women, all strangled, all found in Los Angeles. Their cases had been cold for decades, frozen in time, and now this 72-year-old drifter sitting quietly in custody was linked to all 3 of them. Sam claimed innocence, naturally. He claimed he'd never hurt anyone. He claimed the women didn't look familiar. He claimed he didn't even know what the detectives were talking about. But this time, the evidence wasn't based on witness memories or unreliable notes or missing paperwork. This time, the case didn't depend on whether a jury believed a woman society had ignored. This time, science was talking. And DNA doesn't stutter. Detectives began piecing together his decades-long trail, phone records, travel patterns, old arrest reports, the occasional motel receipt, the kind of mundane details that become damning when lined up correctly. And the more they looked, the more the timeline began to breathe. The drifter life that had once protected him now betrayed him, leaving a faint breadcrumb trail across the entire country. Investigators from other states started calling Los Angeles. Hey, we have an old case that looks similar. Hey, this guy was here in the 1980s. Hey, we arrested him once in 92. Hey, we've never solved this one. Could you send us his DNA profile? It was the first time the nation collectively realized that Sam hadn't just been a local threat. He had been everywhere. Every time he moved to a new town, a new state, a new coast, he carried a trail of uncounted bodies with him. And now, slowly, painfully, those threads were being pulled together. Sam sat in his cell with that same quiet, polite demeanor he'd weaponized his whole life. He'd smile, he'd chat. Wirkte wie ein alter Mann, der sich über zu viel Aufmerksamkeit beklagt. But behind that soft tone was the growing realization that this time he was not walking out. The police kept digging. Every drawer that had once been ignored was opened. Every forgotten case file got pulled from storage. Evidence that had once been considered hopeless suddenly had a new name to compare it to. Samuel Little. And slowly, the myth of his invisibility began to crack. When the trial began, prosecutors presented him not as an aging man shuffling slowly into court, but as the predator he had always been. Witnesses testified, experts spoke, DNA told its story with cold precision, and Sam watched it all unfold with an expression investigators later described as mild annoyance, as if being confronted with decades of murder accusations was somehow inconvenient but not particularly surprising. He was convicted in 2014 for 3 murders, the first official acknowledgement of what he had done. But the full truth, that was still buried, still hidden in his mind, still waiting to surface. When Samuel Little first entered prison after his 2014 conviction, most investigators assumed his story was finished. An elderly man, 3 life sentences, a body that was starting to fail him. What more was there to say? Men like him usually stayed silent until the day they died, protecting their secrets the way dragons sit on gold they'll never spend. But Sam wasn't like most killers. Power for him didn't come from freedom. Power came from being the only person in the world who knew the full truth. And prison gave him a new audience. It started quietly. A comment here, a brag there, the kind of offhand remarks inmates make when they want to sound important. But then word reached a Texas Ranger named James Holland. A man so persistent he could probably convince a brick wall to reconsider its life choices. Holland had a reputation. If someone was hiding murders, he would find them. And when he heard Sam's name, he had a feeling the story wasn't over. So he visited him. Not aggressively, not dramatically. Holland didn't slam photos onto tables or yell accusations across metal desks. He sat down, leaned back, and treated Sam like a human being. Something Sam responded to instantly. Predators often do. They mistake politeness for admiration. They mistake attention for validation. And Sam, who had spent decades being ignored, suddenly felt seen in the sickest way possible. At first, he denied everything. He denied knowing the victims, denied remembering anything, denied even being in some of the states where the murders occurred. Classic Sam. Calm, polite, lying with such smoothness that you almost admired the performance. But Holland didn't push. He let Sam talk, let him drift through stories about childhood, old boxing matches, odd jobs, petty crimes, all the little detours that gave Sam the illusion he was in control. And then, slowly, the subject began to shift. It was Sam who changed it. He leaned forward, lowered his voice, and said something that made the air in the room tighten. You know, I've done some bad things. Holland didn't flinch. He didn't interrupt. He simply nodded, like a man listening to a stranger confess he'd once parked in a disabled spot. And in that moment, Sam tasted something he hadn't felt in decades. The thrill of being the most interesting person in the room. So he began to talk, not in bursts, not nervously, calmly, almost fondly. He described his first kill like he was recalling a fishing trip, the weather, the location, the way the night smelled. He described the fear in the women he strangled with the same tone another man might use to recall a dance partner. He described their final moments not with remorse, but with satisfaction, as if strangling them had been, in his words, a kind of art. And Holland listened, pen moving slowly, eyes never leaving Sam's face. Sam spoke for hours, days, weeks. Each time Holland visited, more details spilled out. Cities, years, names when he remembered them. Sometimes just descriptions. She was small, black hair, liked to laugh. I left her near a road with a lot of trees. He talked about Los Angeles, Miami, Cincinnati, Phoenix, the Gulf Coast, the Midwest. Towns barely big enough for a gas station. Big cities where no one noticed anything unless it directly inconvenienced them. And as he talked, the number of murders kept rising, until it surpassed anything investigators expected. 93 women strangled, killed between the early 1970s and 2005. And he remembered them like a collector remembers rare items, not deeply, not personally, but with a disturbing sense of ownership. Detectives across the country could barely keep up. Every confession triggered a phone call to another state, another cold case unit, another morgue drawer. And what shocked them wasn't just the volume, it was the accuracy. He remembered clothing, jewelry, specific locations, cars, tiny details no liar could improvise. The more he talked, the more he delighted in it. He smiled, he chuckled, he corrected detectives gently when they got details wrong. He leaned back in his wheelchair as if recounting pleasant memories from a long vacation. For the first time in his life, Samuel Little felt powerful without laying a hand on anyone. What made it even more unsettling was the way he spoke about his victims. He didn't use their names, didn't describe their humanity, didn't acknowledge their pain. He talked about them like silhouettes, outlines of women who existed only in the moments he decided to kill them. He remembered their faces, their hair, the way their necks looked when they were scared, but nothing else. To him, they weren't people. They were moments. Investigators found themselves caught in a strange emotional tension. On one hand, his confessions were unlocking decades of cold cases, giving closure to families who had long given up hope. On the other hand, listening to him describe these murders with such callous pleasure felt like stepping into the darkest corner of the human psyche. And still, he wasn't done. Every interview opened a new door, revealed a new city, unearthed a new victim. His words painted a portrait of a man who had spent 40 years drifting through America like a storm no one noticed, leaving devastation behind him while the world looked away. By the time Samuel Little had finished talking his way through dozens of murders, the investigators thought they had seen the worst of him. The numbers were horrifying, the details were precise, and the casual way he described each killing felt like listening to someone recount old drinking stories. But then, he did something no one was expecting. He asked for art supplies, not a television, not extra snacks, colored pencils. He told them he could still see the faces of his victims in his mind, clear as the day he last saw them. Dates, years, and exact locations, that all blurred together for him, he said. But the faces remained. The tilt of a jawline, the way the eyebrows sat, the shade of lipstick, the hairstyle that was fashionable or not in a specific year. Tiny visual anchors that stayed long after any remorse might have faded. If you gave him paper, he said, he could show them. So they let him draw. The first portrait was unsettling in a way that had nothing to do with blood or violence. It was disturbingly gentle. He drew slowly, carefully, leaning over the paper with the concentration of someone restoring a delicate object, instead of resurrecting the memory of a woman he had strangled. His hands, old and veined, moved with surprising steadiness. He shaded in cheekbones, defined noses, added curls and braids and hoop earrings. The women he had murdered reappeared on the page, not as corpses or crime scene photos, but as they might have looked the last time they were alive and laughing. He gave each drawing what he could not give them in life: attention. The investigators watched him work and felt a kind of double horror. On the one hand, there was the obvious grotesqueness of it. A killer lovingly sketching the faces of women he had killed, as if they were cherished muses instead of victims. On the other hand, there was the usefulness. For many of these women, there had never been a proper photo, no driver's license snapshot still on file, no family picture that survived the decades. In some cases, the police had the remains of a woman whose face they had never actually seen. And now here he was, drawing them from memory like a twisted, living archive. Soon, there wasn't just one portrait. There were dozens. Black women, white women, Latina women. Young faces, older faces, faces that looked tired, others that looked defiant. Different hair textures, eye shapes, little details like a gap between the teeth, or a particular style of eyeliner that practically screamed a specific era. He remembered some of their names, but not all. Some he could place in a city. That one was in Miami. This one was near Houston. Others he only tied to vague impressions like it was cold there or there were mountains. It was macabre. But it was also the best lead many cold case detectives had had in their entire careers. When the FBI eventually decided to release the portraits to the public, It felt like something out of a surreal gallery exhibition. Page after page of hand-drawn women, each labelled only with a guess at where she might have died, and roughly when. Not mugshots, not police composites, more like intimate illustrations, filtered through the memory of the man who had taken their lives. The Bureau didn't dress it up with fancy language. They simply said in höflich bürokratischem tone, "These are believed to be victims of Samuel Little. Do you recognize them?" And disturbingly often, the answer was yes. Families saw a face and felt their stomach drop. A sister recognized the way the hair curled around the ears. A cousin recognized a particular jawline. A childhood friend recognized the way the eyebrows arched. In several cases, those drawings became the missing puzzle pieces that finally linked a long-disappeared woman to an unidentified body and an unsolved case. Some relatives had gone decades without answers, stuck in that uniquely cruel state where you don't know whether to grieve or to hope. Then they opened a website, saw a coloured pencil drawing, and realised that the man who killed her remembered her more clearly than the state ever did. It would be comforting to imagine that he drew them out of guilt. He didn't. If you listen closely to the way he talked about the portraits, there's no remorse there. There's pride. Pride in his memory. Pride in his talent. Pride in the fact that even after all these years, he could summon their likenesses better than anyone else could. He presented these sketches like trophies disguised as tributes, proof that his internal catalogue of victims was more complete than any official record. Investigators found themselves clinging to the drawings anyway, because whatever his motive, the results worked. They compared his sketches with old missing person files, with Jane Doe reconstructions, with long-forgotten local rumours about that girl who disappeared one summer. Some matches were almost eerie in their precision. The same hairstyle, the same jewellery, even the same expression. Other times, the resemblance was more interpretive, but still close enough to push a stagnant case forward. The portraits also intensified one of the central questions about Samuel Little. Just how accurate was his memory? Was it photographic, as he liked to boast, or was he embellishing, merging different women in his mind, blending fantasy and reality until no one could untangle them again? Some law enforcement officials believed him almost completely. Others were more cautious, pointing out that he often muddled dates and places, even when the general story checked out. But with each drawing pinned to a map, a picture emerged that no one could ignore. His memory might not have been perfect, yet it was reliable enough to reopen investigations all over the country. Even when the details didn't align neatly, the broad strokes often did, and when a sketch, a confession, and an old case file lined up, it was hard to argue that he'd simply invented it. The strange thing is that in these last active years of his life, Samuel Little finally became what he had never been before: visible. His face appeared on news segments, his drawings circulated online. Detectives who had never heard of him suddenly had whole boards dedicated to his movements. Families who had assumed their loved ones were forgotten learned that somewhere, behind prison walls, the man responsible was still thinking about them, not with regret, but with an artist's cold satisfaction. For the public, the idea that a man could kill so many women and still remember their faces decades later was almost the most haunting part. The murders were monstrous, but that lingering, intimate recall, the way he could summon the curve of a smile or the tilt of a nose, made it feel as if those women had been trapped in his mind the entire time. As if he had carried them with him like a private gallery only he could access. For all the detail Samuel Little poured into his drawings and confessions, there was always a fog around the edges. a shifting mist where truth, half-truth, and whatever passed for his personal mythology tangled together. Investigators quickly discovered that not every confession aligned as neatly as they'd hoped. Some of his memories fit the evidence with surgical precision. Others felt like shapes in the dark, close enough to recognize, too blurry to trust. The inconsistencies weren't always dramatic. Sometimes it was a year that didn't quite match. Sometimes a city that was almost right but not quite. Sometimes a victim he described vividly, down to her clothing and jewelry, yet no case file anywhere in the state resembled it. That was the problem with interviewing a man whose crimes spanned 4 decades and dozens of jurisdictions. His mind had become its own archive. And like any archive, parts were intact and others had been eaten by time. Investigators tried to map everything he said. They built timelines that looked like train schedules crossed with spider webs. They pinned colored notes across the walls of their offices like determined but sleep-deprived detectives in a crime show. They listened to recordings again and again, rewinding small details. A bar with neon lights, a road near a swamp, a woman with a chipped front tooth. Each detail felt promising until it collided with something that didn't fit. One confession described a woman he claimed to have killed near Macon, Georgia, in 1977. The problem? Sam was in a Florida jail that year. Another involved a woman he said he left near a long bridge over water, except the town he mentioned had no bridges, long or otherwise. Then there was the case where he insisted the victim wore a red dress, yet the skeletal remains found decades earlier were recorded wearing jeans and a tank top. Could the clothes have changed? Could he have misremembered? Or had the wrong remains been attributed to the wrong story? No one knew. And that was the uncomfortable truth. Sometimes he remembered too much, and sometimes he remembered just enough to cause chaos. It didn't help that Sam loved an audience. He loved the chair, the microphone, the attention. He loved being the centerpiece of a room full of professionals, quietly horrified by his calm certainty. And when a man like that realizes that every story he tells earns him more hours of conversation, more visits, more significance, well, it becomes hard to tell where honesty ends and ego begins. Detectives debated it constantly. Some swore he was incapable of lying about murder. Others insisted he blended fantasy and reality whenever it suited him. Texas Ranger Holland, who knew him best, believed most confessions were true. But even he admitted Sam sometimes got lost in the years. A poetic way of saying, the man's brain was a rotirande schublade voller Erinnerungen, and occasionally he pulled out the wrong file. For the families, these uncertainties were brutal. Imagine hearing a confession that sounds exactly like your sister or your mother. The description perfect, the timing close, the location familiar, only for investigators to say, we can't confirm it. Some families waited for closure that never came. Others were handed partial answers wrapped in questions they could never fully unravel. And then there were the Jane Does, women buried without names, marked only by dates and approximate ages. Some of Sam's confessions seemed to match these cases perfectly. Others were tantalizingly close, but not quite precise enough to justify reopening graves or reinvestigating decades-old files. The FBI kept a public list titled Unmatched Confessions, a grim phrase that essentially means these victims almost certainly existed, but we may never find them. The hardest part was the geography. Sam had drifted through so many states, so many towns, so many nameless side roads that investigators began to suspect He might have killed in places where record keeping had been sloppy, corrupt, or lost entirely. Rural towns that no longer had the same police departments. Cases that had been misfiled, mislabeled, or buried under administrative neglect. Entire counties where the disappearance of a woman struggling with poverty, addiction, or homelessness wasn't documented thoroughly enough to survive 5 years, let alone 40. And as detectives dug through these missing pieces, a chilling possibility emerged. Perhaps some of his victims were never found at all. Maybe their bodies were overlooked. Maybe they were discovered but never connected. Maybe they were cremated as unidentified. Their stories erased before Sam ever confessed. And then there's the darkest possibility of all. That even Sam didn't remember every name, every face, every location. 40 years is a long time. Memory decays unevenly. Details fuse. Faces blur. Moments mix. In a twisted way, the truthfulness of his confessions became less important than the acknowledgement that the full count, the full human cost, might be forever beyond reach. 93 was the number he gave. Investigators could confirm about 60. The rest remained suspended in a limbo of probably, possibly, and maybe someday. It leaves you with a strange, heavy feeling that this man, who remembered cheekbones and hairstyles with eerie clarity, still left behind a trail of victims the world may never identify. And that some families, even now, decades later, may not realize their loved one's story was tangled in the path of a man who drifted through America like a shadow no one bothered to chase. By the time Samuel Little entered the final stretch of his life, he no longer resembled the man who had drifted through America for 40 years. Gone was the tall, intimidating drifter with a boxer's shoulders. In his place sat an old man in a wheelchair, wrapped in prison blankets, bones pressing through thinning skin, eyes half hidden behind drooping lids. Time had finally done to him what no police department ever managed. It slowed him down. His cell in California's state prison medical facility was less a room than a waiting area for death. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and old paint. Nurses came and went. Guards rolled him to medical checks like he was an unruly shopping cart. Other inmates barely paid attention to him. To them, he was just another elderly prisoner attached to oxygen. The kind of man you see muttering in a hallway and assume has already served multiple lifetimes worth of regret. Except Sam didn't regret anything. Not a single moment. Even near the end, he enjoyed talking. As long as there was someone to listen, he would lean forward in that wheelchair and recount the same stories, the same murders, the same memories, polishing each one like a stone he kept in his pocket. Texas Ranger Holland kept visiting while he still could, recording hours of interviews as. Sam's voice grew thinner, but his memory remained disturbingly sharp. You could hear the rattle in his lungs, the way he took long, wheezing breaths, but his tone never wavered when he spoke about his victims. If anything, the older he became, the more serene he sounded. A man reminiscing, not confessing. He enjoyed the interviews for reasons that were obvious to everyone but him. He liked being important. He liked being the center of a room. He liked that even behind bars, especially behind bars, entire police agencies still came to him for answers. And the prison staff noticed. They talked about him the way one talks about an eccentric uncle. Odd, unsettling, polite in an uncanny way. He complimented nurses. He cracked jokes at inappropriate times. He smiled in a way that made everyone instinctively step back. There was a softness about him now, but it wasn't gentleness. It was the softness of something rotten being slowly eaten away. Some guards found him fascinating. Others refused to be alone with him. even though he could barely lift his own cup. There was something about the way he watched people, the same quiet appraisal, the same slow measuring, the same predatory calm he'd carried all his life. Stranger still, he had no outbursts, no fits, no violence. He was well behaved in the way a retired wolf might seem well behaved once all its teeth have fallen out. But his mind? His mind still had bite. He talked often about God protecting him, about destiny, about how he was meant to survive this long. He saw his longevity not as luck or coincidence, but as some kind of cosmic approval, a delusion that fit neatly with the arrogance that had carried him through decades of killing. Even as his body broke down, he still believed he was special, chosen, untouchable. Investigators kept visiting until the very end, because Sam kept offering new details. Sometimes it was a name he suddenly remembered. Sometimes a location became clearer in his mind. Sometimes he contradicted himself, then corrected the contradiction, then contradicted the correction. It was a frustrating dance, one the detectives tolerated, because even a single concrete detail could mean a break in a decades-old case. The interviews became shorter as his health failed. His voice grew raspier. He sometimes fell asleep mid-sentence. Then he'd wake up, clear his throat, and return to describing some long-dead woman's hairstyle, as if he'd just hit pause on an old home movie. His mind was fading, but in ways that felt strategically selective. The memories of murder stayed sharp long after the memories of everyday life had begun to dissolve. It was bitterly ironic. The man who forgot birthdays, street names, and years still remembered the faces of his victims. In his final months, he was transferred entirely to medical care. His world shrank to a bed, a blanket, a handful of staff, and the occasional detective hoping for one last trace of truth. Reporters weren't allowed near him, but they didn't need to be. The interviews, the drawings, the confessions, everything that mattered had already been recorded. Sam himself had become irrelevant. All he had left were his stories. He died in December 2020. No dramatic scene, no final confession, just an old man in a medical wing, slipping away in the night like a cigarette burning into ash. For someone who had taken dozens of lives through violence and terror, his own exit was astonishingly quiet. Too quiet, some might say, almost indecent in its gentleness. There was no grand reckoning, no deathbed apology, no sudden burst of remorse. He simply faded out, taking with him whatever unspoken details he still held, and leaving behind a grief that stretched across states, decades, and generations. And strangely, death did not end his influence. If anything, it made the unanswered questions louder. Investigators still pore over his interviews. Families still search his sketches, hoping for a match. Cold case units still reopen files because a phrase he muttered once might be the missing key. Even in death, he continues to occupy the quiet corners of police stations, the dusty shelves of archives, the nightmares of those who studied him. When Samuel Little died, the world didn't stop. No nationwide memorials, no candlelight vigils, no documentaries released overnight. His passing registered as a headline, then faded beneath far more pressing news: elections, pandemics, celebrities doing things that celebrities do. But the people who work in cold case units, the families who still keep fading photographs in drawers, the detectives who spent years trying to decode his wandering path, for them, his death wasn't closure. It was a reminder that some truths die with the man who carried them. In the months after his passing, investigators everywhere sifted through the materials he left behind. Recordings, transcripts, sketches, timelines. A disturbing scrapbook of a life lived in shadows. Some of those files confirmed what they already knew. Others opened new questions. And some sat in that painfully familiar limbo. Maybe true, maybe not. Maybe we'll never know. Because here's the uncomfortable truth about Samuel Little. He was only caught because the world changed. Not because he slipped up. Not because he grew careless. But because technology finally filled the gaps that institutions never bothered to patch. He thrived in places where the system didn't see, or didn't want to see, the women he targeted. Race, addiction, poverty, homelessness, sex work, all the vulnerabilities he preyed on were the same vulnerabilities that made his victims invisible in official paperwork. It's not poetic. It's not dramatic. It's simply the truth. The system wasn't built to protect the women he killed, and he understood that long before anyone understood him. Today, agencies call him the most prolific serial killer in US history. Not because 93 is an official, meticulously verified number, but because no other known killer has come close, and because investigators know, deep down, that the real count might be higher. The FBI confirmed about 60. Dozens remain unverified. Some may never be matched to missing person reports, because those reports were never filed in the first place. The portraits he left behind, those strange, intimate drawings, continue to float through online databases, posted and reposted every time a new Jane Doe case resurfaces. Sometimes they spark hope. Sometimes they spark confusion. And sometimes they simply sit there, haunting and unresolved, faces without names trapped in the memories of a man who no longer exists. For the families who got answers because of him, the relief is complicated. Closure sounds like a gift, but it often arrives wrapped in pain. Knowing what happened is not the same as healing from it. And for those who never received confirmation, the lack of answers cuts even deeper now that the one man who knew the truth is gone. All that remains are sketches, interviews, and the faint hope that cold case evidence somewhere might still hold a match. As for the investigators who spent years interviewing him, their reflections vary. Some describe him as the most cooperative offender they had ever encountered. Others say he used cooperation as another form of control. Most agree on one thing: he understood the interview room better than almost anyone they'd ever met. He controlled pacing. He chose which memories to reveal and which to keep private. He leaned back in his chair like a king receiving guests. For a man who spent his life drifting, the interview room became his final throne. His legacy inside criminology is similarly tangled. Some researchers see him as the ultimate example of how systemic failures allow predators to flourish. Others focus on his psychology. The mix of narcissism, detachment, and predatory calm that defined his behavior. And then there are those who simply see the tragedy. A man who never should have been able to harm more than one person, managing to harm nearly 100 because he learned early on that society didn't track the people he targeted. It's tempting to end stories like this with a sense of resolution, a lesson, a warning, a moral. But Samuel Little doesn't fit neatly into any of those boxes. His life wasn't a cautionary tale so much as a grim illustration of what happens when human beings fall through every crack at once. The victim, the offender, the community, the system. There are no heroes here, no redemption arcs, no final justice that balances the scales. What remains is quiet. A few dozen solved cases, many more that may never be solved. portraits pinned to digital boards, families still searching, detectives still wondering if they missed something, and a final, unsettling understanding. He didn't succeed because he was brilliant. He succeeded because the world wasn't paying attention. As the years move on, his name fades a little more, overshadowed by newer cases, louder headlines, and the relentless churn of true crime fascination. But his victims, those whose names we know and those whose names remain lost, continue to exist in the background of American history. Their stories don't end because his did. Their absence is still felt in the quiet spaces of families and towns that never understood why someone didn't come home. When you strip away the sensationalism, the interviews, the portraits, the headlines, you're left with a truth that lands like a stone in still water. Samuel Little wasn't a monster born in myth. He was a man shaped by neglect, emboldened by indifference, and allowed to roam because no one connected the dots. In the end, the only legacy that matters is theirs. The lives interrupted, the stories unfinished, and the hope that one day every unnamed face in his drawings will be given back her name. And that's where we'll leave it tonight. In the long, quiet echo of a case that stretched across decades, states, and far too many forgotten lives. If you're still awake, congratulations. You've survived another deep dive into the darker corners of history. And if you're drifting off right now, honestly, that's probably the healthiest response to all of this. If you want to support what we do here, the late nights, the research rabbit holes, the endless rewriting to keep YouTube from having a nervous breakdown, you can always drop us a like or a comment. It helps more than you think. And if you've got a case you want us to unravel next, tell us. We always keep an eye on the suggestions, even when the stories get a little too close for comfort. For now, breathe out. Let the room settle. Let your mind put everything back into its quiet little boxes. This is Napmax Sleep Stories. And you've just listened to the true story of Samuel Little. A long, slow descent into the shadows, delivered in a voice soft enough to help you sleep through the horror. Sleep well, Sleepless Rabble. We'll see you in the next one.